Apple's M1 Ultra chip within the Mac Studio is an absolute engineering marvel that pushes the boundaries of performance by combining two M1 Max dies together using their new UltraFusion die-to-die interconnect technology. But I've been doing a ton of research over the past week looking into how Apple could take this tech even further to create essentially an M2 Extreme chip, which would essentially be two Ultras stitched together for a total of 4 dies, creating basically the most powerful chip you can find in a consumer PC today, breaking records left and right. And in this video, I'm going to explain exactly how Apple is going to pull this off in an easy to understand way, as well as how Apple is going to be able to cool it down, and also how much performance we can expect to squeeze out of it. And I actually paid $30 to download TSMC's PDF file on their new 5th generation Kaos S platform with their brand new Interposer, which is used for UltraFusion, so I could learn exactly how all of this is gonna work. So if you appreciate the effort, click subscribe to show your support. Now, if you watched my previous video on the M2 Ultra Duo, I based it on Apple's 3D chip stacking patents, but because of some major leaks that came in over this week, I now believe that it makes much more sense to use a different method, with the 4 dies actually being joined side by side like in this mock-up. And before I get into explaining how it's gonna work and showing you guys a bunch of official Apple patent images from hours and hours of research, I wanna explain why I no longer believe the 3D stack chip design is coming this year. First of all, Mark Gurman was the #1 reason why I thought Apple would go the chip stacking route, because it would actually be possible with the M1 Max dies, which he said would end up in a quad chip Mac Pro with 40 cores. But in his recent Power On newsletter, he updated his leak to include the likelihood of this quad chip being based on the M2 Max dies instead, which will actually be a 12-core chip. And this is a big deal because the M2 Max could easily have 2 die-to-die interconnects like you see in this image, so Apple would just have to rotate them around to combine them into a quad die chip. And this actually makes the most sense because it'll be much easier to cool because you'll have such a large package area to place the heatsink onto instead of dealing with a dual stacked die package. But going even further, Majin Buu on Twitter leaked an official Apple schematic showing not 1, but 3 UltraFusion interposer connections, and right there in the corner is exactly what it looks like. A quad die chip with UltraFusion connecting it vertically and horizontally. And making it even better, this source who leaked the schematic says that he believes this quad chip will be shipping within a new Mac Pro by September, which makes a WWDC reveal extremely likely. And the best part about this leak is that it perfectly matches up to Ross Young's leak for a new 27-inch mini LED display that he believes will be shipping by September as well. And he even told me that he expects it to be revealed at WWDC alongside the Mac Pro. So I'm basically 100% sure about the Mac Pro coming at WWDC. But getting back to that leaked diagram, you'll notice that there are multiple UltraFusion interposer chips with varying sizes. And before I can explain how these are going to connect all 4 of the dies, you absolutely must understand how the current M1 Ultra chip's UltraFusion works first, so let's get into that. Within that PDF from TSMC, there are some licensed images that I unfortunately can't show you guys, but thankfully, they actually made some of these public, so check this out. In this Kaos S progress slide, TSMC literally showed off an image of the M1 Ultra's interposer, which matches up to Apple's marketing image of the M1 Ultra chip. You have 2 large areas for the 2 M1 Max dies and 8 smaller areas for the RAM chips, so everything is basically placed right onto that interposer. Now, if you don't know what an interposer is, TSMC's latest version can be up to 2500 millimeters squared in size, and it actually features 5 layers where there can literally be direct metal connections stitched through it. And if you have a hard time imagining what the silicon interposer looks like, imagine a big block of jello consisting of 5 different layers, which can house a bunch of metal connections and signals between the M2 Max dies and the unified memory chips. And to better explain this, I dug through Apple's patents and I found this patent image, which is actually flipped upside down. And as you can see, 104A and 104B are actually 2 M1 Max dies, and this right here in the middle is quite literally 5 different layers of UltraFusion metal stitchings connecting both of the dies together. And if you don't believe me when I say stitchings, here's another patent image that I found showing the stitchings from the side. And the best part about the silicon interposer is that it can actually be used for routing memory channels, as you can see in this image of the interposer sitting between the PCB substrate, which is the motherboard, and the multiple chips, with 5 layers of interposer visible in the center. But making things even better, there can also be TSVs, or through silicon vias, which can allow connections to be made vertically from the chips directly into the PCB using the redistribution layer, which sends signals horizontally and allows connections to those TSVs, which means that everything like the I/O and the Thunderbolt connections can actually travel down through the interposer and into the motherboard instead of having to use a traditional connection like we have on the M1 Max chip. And then finally, there can also be an active interposer where Apple can embed dedicated chips and controllers to manage power usage and different various signals and whatever else they want to do. But the main point you need to know is that Apple starts with a chip package and then places a silicon interposer on top of it that consists of 5 different layers and a redistribution fan-out layer, which is essentially what Apple is using to make those over 10,000 wired stitching connections between both M1 Max dies to create the M1 Ultra chip. And now, with that said, let's finally get into how Apple is gonna make the quad die M2 Extreme chip work. First of all, TSMC says that their new high-performance silicon interposer is limited to 2500 millimeters squared in size, which is not going to be enough for the massive quad die M2 Extreme, including all of the RAM chips that they need on the package. But if you actually purchase the PDF, you get access to a big secret. Apparently, they have something called quadruple mask stitching, which literally allows them to take 4 interposer squares and stitch them together for a massive interposer. And in TSMC's testing, there were no issues with stability while doing this. And yes, I confirmed with the source that Apple is in fact using quadruple mask stitching for the quad die chip. But now getting into how Apple is gonna stitch the 4 dies together, the most interesting part is that Apple's codename for this new chip is Red Fern, which was apparently the first high-end sportswear brand potentially known for its sophisticated level of stitching. And speaking of that stitching, a secret source has confirmed that there will be a total of 12 UltraFusion connections between the 4 dies. So that's 3 connections per die, which explains why the leaked diagram has 3 UltraFusions shown. So I ended up discussing all of this with TATech15 on Twitter, who shares my fascination for this type of stuff, and he was able to draw up a bunch of diagrams showing how all this is gonna work. As you can see, we have 2 Ultra chips on the left and the right, which already contain UltraFusion connections between the top and bottom M2 Max dies, which are labeled Daisy 1 and Daisy 2. But one thing you'll notice is that both of the top dies have 2 UltraFusion connections between them, both a Daisy XL narrow and a Daisy XL wide, which was shown in that leak at the top right corner. And if you're wondering why there's two of them, it's probably to make sure that there's enough bandwidth since you're going from one M2 Ultra chip over to the other. And then finally, there's the Daisy XL Sub 2, which doesn't look like it makes sense until you look at this little drawing showing that this connection wraps all of them together in a lower level of the interposer, kind of like in an L shape. And you'll also notice a couple of dots, which are actually the controller chips within the active interposer, which sends signals and controls the different dies. And if this doesn't seem like it's possible, the source confirmed that each max die will be edited to have paths integrated into the silicon to make all of those connections possible. So it's definitely going to be more complicated than it seems, kind of like this diagram with connections going all over the place. And because of the combination of 12 total connections between all the dies, I have no doubt that Apple will be able to achieve essentially 2 times scaling in terms of raw performance, going from the Ultra to the Ultra Duo or the Extreme. So if this new chip was based on M1 Max dies, that would mean a Geekbench 5 multi-core score of around 48,000 points, which would be competing with some of the best AMD EPYC server chips out there, like the 7713, which has an MSRP of $7,000 alone and a TDP of 225 watts. And the craziest thing of all is that the maximum TDP on the new M2 Extreme should be around 120 watts, so half the power usage for around the same performance. But wait, those numbers are based on M1 Max dies, and we're almost certain at this point that the new Extreme chip will be based on the M2 Max, which is rumored to be a 12-core chip instead of 10 like on the M1 Max. And this means that the M2 Extreme will be even more powerful, especially since we know that the M2 will at least be based on the A15 Bionic chip's cores, which, as you can see in this image, are quite a bit larger than the cores on the A14 chip, which the M1 Max is based on. And because of that, TA Tech 15 drew out a diagram showing that the M2 Max die should be quite a bit larger, as you can see with the dotted line. And this is very important because it's going to give them a bit more room to fit memory channels and I/O around the top and the left sides, while packing the die-to-die interconnects on both the bottom and the right side in orange. And this is going to be the secret sauce to the M2 Extreme because they'll be able to rotate this new M2 Max die around the package and combine them all together like we saw in that leaked Apple schematic. And now, with that said, there are 2 more topics to talk about, including how Apple is going to deal with the RAM and PCI Express slot situation, as well as how they're going to cool down this chip. According to Majinbuu's source, the Daisy XL connection that goes into the sub 2 layer of the interposer can apparently access a separate memory controller to access up to 1 terabyte of memory. Yes, I said 1 terabyte. And he even told us that currently the 1 terabyte of RAM has slower access times than on the older Xeon Mac Pro, which basically confirms that Apple is going to have extra RAM slots on the motherboard that directly connect to the M2 Extreme chip using that Daisy XL sub 2 connection with a built-in controller. So what we're most likely to see is the M2 Extreme coming with 256 gigs of unified memory built onto the actual package, and then a bunch of extra RAM slots, just so that the real pros who need that much RAM can still pay for it. However, I was reading through TSMC's PDF document, and it mentioned that this new 5th generation of CoWoS S technology supports 8 stacks of HBM3 memory. And the beautiful thing about using HBM is that it'll allow them to save a ton of package space while greatly increasing bandwidth and allowing for up to 1 terabyte of memory on the package itself. But I think this is gonna be way too expensive and just overkill in terms of the bandwidth, so I think that Apple is gonna be sticking to traditional LPDDR RAM, especially since they can use the interposer layers to route the RAM connections through the substrate, which Hishnash on Twitter has confirmed to me, and then they can get creative with the RAM placement, like in these images that Hishnash mocked up, or like in this example that I made a few months ago in this M1 Max quad video. And now as for the PCI Express slot situation, while I personally don't think that they're gonna wanna keep supporting third-party AMD graphics cards, I do think there's a very good chance that Apple is working on their very own external GPU cards. And the reason for my speculation on this is a little something called Lifuka, which was a leaked code name for a dedicated GPU meant for the iMac Pro. And that makes sense because Lifuka is an island on the Kingdom of Tonga, which just so happens to be another code name for the M1 chip. So I believe by the whole island code name, Apple's engineers implied that this Apple Silicon GPU was meant to be separated from the main SoC package, and I think we'll be seeing it in the new Mac Pro, and I think it's going to be directly connected to the M2 Extreme using the Daisy XL Sub 2 connection. And now, finally, for the cooling part of the video. Since I don't think they'll be stacking M2 Ultra chips anymore, it's going to be a lot easier to cool. So the first thing we need to do is figure out how much power the M2 Extreme will take, which brings us back to the M1 Max die, which according to AnandTech used a maximum of 92 watts when both the CPU and GPU were under a 100% stress load. And keep in mind that this is totally unrealistic and no regular workload will make this happen, but if we multiply 92 by 4 dies, we get 386 peak maximum wattage that will need to be cooled for the worst case scenarios. And if that sounds like a crazy amount, it's absolutely not, because some of the GPUs in Apple's current Mac Pro use up to 500 watts of power and they're being cooled passively. Yes, passively, with just a heatsink and the Mac Pro's main 3 fans. But going back to the Mac Pro's announcement, Apple said that the CPU's passive heatsink can handle more than 300 watts of power, and not peak power, but sustained 300 watts. So this basically leaves us with a gap of 68 watts between those old Xeons and the new M2 Extreme, which I think Apple will have no problem cooling for a couple of different reasons. First of all, the TSMC PDF that I purchased details 2 new thermal solutions, including a ring-type package with die backside surface exposed for direct contact with the heatsink, which is something that Apple has already implemented on the M1 Ultra in detailed public patents with great success. And they also mentioned a new TIM, or thermal interface material, which allows them to bond the heatsink plate directly over the chips for 100% coverage, allowing for the least amount of thermal resistance possible for maximum heat transfer into the heatsink. And now the second reason is that Apple has already confirmed that they're using a new, much heavier copper heatsink in the Mac Studio to cool down the M1 Ultra chip, which basically confirms that Apple will be using copper in the Mac Pro cooler as well, which will make it much easier to cool down 368 watts of power from the M2 Extreme. And to finish off this video, I once again think that the Mac Pro will be revealed at WWDC and ship in September, and I think it'll either come in the same exact chassis as the current Mac Pro, or they're gonna end up shrinking it down by a little bit, potentially like this example that I mocked up months ago. So with that said, hopefully you enjoyed this video, and if you did, go ahead and give me your thoughts on all of this down in the comment section below, and click the circle above to subscribe, because we're about to begin massive amounts of Mac Studio testing this week. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.